Stephen, thanks for joining me. It's an honor to have you on the podcast. I've been looking forward to this conversation for some time now.
Hey, it's my pleasure, Ryan. And I see you reading the Warrior Ethos on your
I
Instagram
am.
feed. So that's
I
great. At least
Yeah,
it's
I am.
short, right?
That's true because I've been reading this as well, and I'm not
Ah,
through it. I haven't read it as fast as I would have liked. When I reached out to you, I said, embarrassingly enough, I haven't got through this book, but what I have got through so far is so fascinating. I've got some of your other books here as well, Turning
uh,
Pro and
all right.
The War of Art. The one I don't have is Do the Work. I was looking at some of my library here earlier today, and I think I must have lent that one out because I give away so many of these books right here.
Ah,
So somebody must have my personal copy, and
uh-huh.
I have no
All right.
idea who it is. It's good to talk with you because 5 years ago, roughly, when I started this movement and podcast, it was really this book, The War of Art, that got me on the path. And I think bringing some sort of a tangible nature to the quote unquote resistance is really
Uh-huh.
what made it
Uh-huh.
more manageable for me. Do you find that that's true for a lot of people?
I do. And I hadn't really, when I originally wrote The War of Art, which was in 2002, I
Mm-hmm.
thought this book is only for writers, you
Mm.
know? And in fact, I wasn't even sure if writers would relate to it. I was wondering if I was the only one that heard this voice in my head and dealt with this demon. But yeah, it seems to, particularly anybody that's kind of entrepreneurial and starting something from scratch, trying to bring a vision into the world, it does seem to resonate.
Yeah. Do you think it's so difficult because people can't really put their hands on it as to what it is, and so it just remains this kind of loose idea, and they don't really know how to articulate what it is, and therefore they can't address it and deal with it?
It's hard to know what goes on in somebody else's head, but I know
True.
for me, I mean, I had I would say a 7 year period where I was just, my ass was getting kicked left, right, and center by
Mm.
resistance. And I had no clue that that was even what was happening. So for me, at least, when I was able to give a name to it and realize that it wasn't my voice that was saying those things in my head, that
Mm.
it was this alien force, this alien negative force that I was able to sort of get a handle on it. So I think maybe that's what it is. I mean,
Yeah.
let me ask you, Ryan, what was it for you what were you struggling with? Was it getting the podcast and the Order of Man and everything going, or what was it?
I wish I could tell you it was this one thing that I just couldn't overcome, but it wasn't like that for me. It seemed to be more of a cloud of inaction and
Uh huh.
almost paralysis by analysis. I
Uh
had so
huh.
many different ideas and thoughts and
Uh
concepts
huh.
and directions and things I wanted to do. And because I had so much of that, that's how it showed itself for me is like,
Uh huh.
okay, I don't know what to do, so I'm not going to do anything.
Uh huh.
I don't know if that's
Yeah.
pretty typical if you hear that quite a bit.
Yeah, it is pretty typical. In fact, even right
Yeah.
now, I'm involved in just doing one small thing, trying to get a graphic image for something I'm working on. And I'm getting to that thing where I've got like so many ideas and I'm paralyzed. And I realize that I've got to just, hey, suck it up, pick something and go for it. But
Yeah,
so yeah.
I think in the grand scheme of things, especially when it comes to putting work out into the world, whether that's writing or music or a podcast or whatever your thing is, that little bit of difference between, this picture you're trying to choose from and this picture isn't really that relevant in the grand scheme of things. It's
No,
probably not going to make a whole lot of
it's
difference.
it's pure resistance. Yeah.
Yeah. You talk about it, and I actually heard you. I was doing some research knowing that we are going to have this conversation and listening to other podcasts you've done, and I listened to you with Oprah.
Ah.
And it was interesting. The thing that really stood out in my mind is when you said, and you said it today just a minute ago, that it's not your voice. That if you hear that in your mind, it's not you. It's something. Why?
Yeah.
Help me articulate that, because I tend to believe, and maybe this is counter to what you think, is that it is us. It's just the weaker, maybe more pathetic version of ourselves, not the potential of who we have to become.
Well, I can tell you this, Ryan, from getting thousands of emails from people and people, describing the voice that they hear in their heads, it's identical. It's across
Mm.
the board. Everybody hears the same thing, except that I do think resistance is so diabolical that it can tailor it exactly to you and your weaknesses, you know. But I like to think of it just as a force of nature, that it's an objective thing, you know, like the seasons or the transiting of Venus across the night sky, you know. And the way resistance fools us, that voice that we hear in our head, you know, that you're not worthy, why are you trying to do this thing? It's been done 1,000 times before, et cetera, et cetera. What gets us is we think that that's our voice, that it's us thinking and realistically assessing, you know, what worthless, you know, opportunists we are, you know. But
Sure,
it's not.
sure.
It's just it's an objective force, just like gravity. And once we sort of realize that, you know, then it's easier to dismiss it and just say, that's not me. I'm not thinking that. That's just, you know, the voice of resistance coming up, and it's always going to come up. And it comes up for everybody.
So you're using that as a tactic or a strategy to be able to more effectively dismiss the ideas that are keeping you back.
Yeah. Yeah.
Makes
That's how I
sense.
view it. And that helps me deal with it.
Yeah, that makes sense. One way I've chosen to look at it is that it's not personal. Like I talk with, even though it's individual, it's not personal. You know, I talk
Yeah,
with so many
that's a
people.
good distinction. That's a
It
good one,
is.
Ryan. I like that. Yeah.
Well, I just think that there's so many people out there who think that, you know, the world's out to get them, or some sort of force is like conspiring against just them and nobody else. And I just think we make ourselves too special when,
Yeah. Yeah.
and you talk about this because you talk about the distinction of talent versus just work. Like, I don't really consider myself all that talented when it comes to podcasts, but why do we do well? Because I've been doing it long enough and I just put in the work, and that's just the natural outcome. But there's no great force conspiring against or for me. It's just what it is.
Yeah, I agree. It's work is everything, you know,
Right.
that I used to think, you know, that, or people used to tell me, you know, or people tell me now that I'm a talent, but for 30 years, they told me I was a bum and I was doing the exact same thing. So it's just a matter of
what's the
work, work, work,
difference?
work, work. Yeah.
What is the difference? Is it just because you have a proven track record, or why even though you're doing the same thing, do people view it
I
differently?
think you do get better. You
Hmm.
definitely get better. You get better whether you realize it or not. You know, particularly in a thing like writing or podcasting, it's not like a physical thing like Michael Jordan. His skills are going to erode at a certain point after time, but for writing or any other the kind of entrepreneurial thing that we're talking about, you do get better. Wouldn't
Yeah.
you agree that you're better now than you were, you know, 6 or 7 years ago?
Yeah, well, I agree with that. It seems that as we continue to grow, more people are willing to point out that I haven't got better, but I would tend to agree that I've gotten better at the craft. um, yeah, the other thing I've noticed too is that you're talking about writing, you're talking about podcasting, creating, exercising the creative muscle. It's very difficult to quantify improvement. I mean, you can look at how many books you've sold or how many downloads you have, but you're not competing like you would on the basketball court, since you brought up that example. And so it's harder to quantify success.
Yeah, that's really true. Because in something like that, it's so subjective, right? One person
Right.
might say, "Oh, he's great." The other person say, "Oh, he's terrible." And even it's very hard even to assess your own self, you know. And in many ways, I think like some of my earlier books were better than stuff I've done lately, but
Hmm.
yet they're not. You know, I can just tell that I'm more in command of the medium and more in command of my material than I was, and I just think it's hard not to get better because you've got that experience and the mistakes that you made in the past now that you made blindly and you couldn't see, now you can see. So it's almost impossible, I think, not to get better. What may go wrong is that your taste may change a little bit and you may be going into more nuanced areas that people who followed you before don't want to follow you into that area. You know, like if you
Sure.
think about Bob Dylan's album and stuff like that, people went crazy. They loved it, you know. But as he kind of evolved and evolved and evolved, I think he's into things that interested him before don't interest him anymore. And
Hmm.
so he's going into another, and a lot of times that area is a place where his old fans don't want to follow him. You know, I'm a fan in a lot of areas he's in. I don't want to follow him, you know. So, but he's getting better.
Well, and I think when you get to that stage, the approval of other people becomes less relevant, which is actually a very
Yes.
nice position to be in. It's not comfortable. It's just you build up some level of confidence where if somebody comes and says, "Hey, I don't like what you do," it's like, "Oh, well, just tune out and go find something else." Like I really don't care at this point.
Do you find that you feel that way, Ryan, about your stuff? Do you find
I
that
do.
you
I
care
mean, there's
less
certain
about?
people. I'm not. Look, I'm not the guy who. And here's one thing I don't really appreciate about this particular perspective of modern culture is this zero F's type mentality where nothing matters and it's nihilistic. It's not that. It's just that because I do care about certain people's perspectives. I do care about the people I admire and respect and look up to. I do care about the way they view my work and what I'm doing. But there's a loss. I'm able to make that distinction. It used to be I cared about what everybody thinks, and now it's the right people.
Uh huh. And how do you decide who the right people are?
I base that on what my goals and objectives are. So certainly my wife is one of those right people
Uh huh.
because I feel I have an obligation and a responsibility to lead effectively within the home and to partner with her.
Uh
And
huh.
so the way she feels about the way I'm showing up is relevant to what I'm trying to create in my life.
Ah, good answer.
Thank you. you know, one of the things is you said the mistakes that you made in the past are different. You're making different mistakes. I almost look at it and think you're making better mistakes, right? Like the
Ah.
mistakes don't go away. They're just better. They're
Uh
more
huh.
sophisticated mistakes,
Yes,
which
that's
lead
a
to
good way
greater
of putting
results
it.
and potential greater loss too, which can be scary in and of
Yeah.
itself.
But the mistakes hurt just as much. That's the
They
thing.
do.
And you definitely feel like I'm an idiot that after all this time I've been working and I'm still screwing up in this, you know, it's the same way, or I'm screwing up in a new way, but it's just as bad.
Yeah, sure. How do you personally deal with that when you do screw up or you do mess up? What is it that you work through on your own?
It's a really good question. And I had a thing maybe a year and a half ago, where a book that I was working on just sort of crashed in the middle. And,
Mm,
I just realized that I'm working with my editor, Sean Coyne, who's a really good friend of mine and a partner of mine in Black Irish Books. And, you know, I got one of those long notes from the editor, where they tell you, this is bad, that you've really gone off the track here. And it really threw me for a loop for weeks, where I actually wrote a bunch of blog posts about this called "Report from the Trenches," and
sure.
funnily enough, or not so funnily enough, people really related to those. I guess I think when you fall down and you're honest about it, everybody can relate to that. So I just had to. I always say there's a thing in the Marine Corps where they say work the problem. You
Mm,
know that that there get the emotional side of it out of it. The emotional side of I'm a loser, I screwed up, the stakes are terrible, et cetera, et cetera, and just think, what went wrong here? So, and the upside of that is if you can just kind of isolate that and hang in and try to, like in writing, it's what went wrong in the story? Why did this not work in the middle? Why did this fall apart? And when you do kind of solve it or figure out what it is, you make a real great leap forward and you learn something. I never realized that, and
mm.
it really helps the craft. But it's, I would say for anybody listening to this that runs into one of those things where something you're working on crashes in the middle, and the tendency is either to walk away from it, to blow it off and walk away,
Yeah.
or to dig in your heels into what you've got, and saying, I am not changing this. This is me. I love it, blah, 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 blah. It really talk about being a man, and you want to define, or I would say what being a professional is in this point is to not give in to those tendencies to walk away from it or to dig in your heels and refuse to budge, is to really open your mind, accept the fact that you can be wrong, accept the fact that you screwed up, take kind of responsibility for that, which is hard and it's painful, and then kind of settle down and solve the problem. And that's a really hard thing to do.
Yeah, I'm glad you talk about it because my follow-up question was going to be like, are there times where just charging and plowing through makes sense? Because that is my natural tendency. If there's a problem or something that gets in my way, maybe it's the hard-headedness or the stubbornness, or maybe a bit of a chip on my shoulder where I'm like, bring it on, because I'm just going to plow right through it. Is there times where that's appropriate?
I would actually say what I was just saying was plowing through,
Mm.
but it's not plowing through blindly, because in a case
Ah.
like that, you really have to kind of solve the issue. Like, I was just thinking about a story that I wrote a book about the Six-Day War, the Arab-Israeli War of
Mm-hmm.
1967, and I went over to Israel and I interviewed a bunch of fighter pilots and et cetera, et cetera. And one story that a fighter pilot told me was he got hit by a missile right underneath the fuselage, and
Hmm.
it somehow had jammed up his landing gear, and he couldn't tell if his landing gear had gone down or not. So that he
Okay.
was trying to come in for a landing,
Sure.
and what he did was he looked for the shadow on the ground. He flew really low and banked, and he could see the shadow of his landing gear. And I thought, now that's working the problem, what,
Mm.
and rather, I mean, if it was me, I'd have been pissing in my pants and
Of
not knowing
course.
what to do. But I mean, that's sort of, you can say that's plowing ahead, Ryan, but it's also really thinking, what's the problem here? How do I solve it? And I thought that was just a great, elegant, simple solution, and that they don't teach you in flight school.
Right. Yeah. Well, they maybe they do now because of
Yeah,
that.
maybe after
Maybe.
that. Yeah. Yeah.
No, that's a really interesting perspective, and it does really require. You talk about pissing your pants. Like it does really require an element of detachment in a very well, in this case, a very dangerous situation. It's
Yeah.
very hard to detach when you're literally talking about life and death.
Yeah. It's not so hard if you're writing a book. You have another day, and you do it the next day or the day after that. But when you're running out of fuel and you don't know whether you can land or not, that's yeah.
Yeah.
So
Well,
that,
I think if we approach our life and our tasks and the things that we want to do with the same level of seriousness, it will certainly help. It seems like we excuse some activities away, like, oh, this isn't important and I'll do it tomorrow, or I've got 6 months to get that done, and we dismiss it and put it off and procrastinate. And before you know it, we find ourselves in a bad situation because we
yeah.
don't hit the deadlines we have for ourselves. We're really flippant, it seems like, when maybe we ought to be more serious about some things.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
I mean, seriousness is the mark of, well, I mean, you're talking about the order of man, or I would call it a professional, but seriousness without being humorless. It's like Michael Jordan. If you were watching any of the Last Dance stuff,
Yeah.
which was great,
Yeah.
you could really see that you know he was in it 100% every second of the day, and I think that's great.
That's what's required to succeed. How do you define what it means to be a professional?
That's a great question, because I've certainly written about it enough. I mean, I think it's in opposition to what being an amateur is. Um, an amateur is somebody that kind of dabbles in something, that's like a weekend warrior that is not fully
Mm-hmm.
committed to whatever it is. If adversity arises, an amateur is going to say, "Well, forget it."
Right.
But a professional, if you think about Michael Jordan or Kobe Bryant or Tom Brady or something like that, a professional plays hurt. A professional deals with the the messy reality on the ground. A professional kind of detaches themselves emotionally from the chaos that's going around them, if you can. Like Tom Brady in a 2-minute drill or something like that. It'd be so easy in that situation, like a fighter pilot or something like that, to just get overwhelmed by the emotion of it. But
Mm-hmm.
I think that a pro is kind of cold blooded. It's a sort of a balance, in the sense that I think a professional in any field is passionate about what they're trying to do. Like Michael Jordan was, off the charts and that sort of thing, particularly when he thought somebody disrespected him. He was definitely going to make him
Right.
pay. But at the
Right.
same time, I think he was very cold blooded about it, and he kind of knew, this is what I have to do, and I'm going to do it, and I'm not going to let anything else get in the way. It's definitely a mindset.
Right. So it does, you're not talking about it from the context of it being a career or even being your income. It
No,
has,
no,
okay.
that's a good question, right? Because it's like you think, oh, professional. I know people start to think, well, that means money. I got to
Right.
get money
Exactly.
for it. But no, I don't. I don't mean that at all. I really mean sort of uh, metaphorically professional. Flipping a switch in your mind to, if you were starting anything, to say, I'm not going to do this as an amateur. I'm not going to do this as a dabbler. I'm going to do this, the way a full out pro would do it.
Do you think you have to make that commitment before you start something? Let's say, for example, somebody's really interested in martial arts or interested in, maybe starting a side business or picking up some new hobby. Do you feel like it's a requirement that they have that professional mindset initially, or are there times where it is, yeah, dabble, and then maybe it turns into something down the road?
I mean, I think sooner or later, you've got to adapt that mindset or else
Mm,
drop out. I think most of us do enter something with an amateur mindset. A lot of
right.
times we're just dumb. We just think, well, hell, I'll just take this up. I'll take up powerlifting, or I'll, run an ultra marathon. No problem, piece of cake, right? And then you get in it, and it's real like, oh my God, what have I gotten myself into? And at some point, you sort of realize you got to ratchet your game up. I'm not
Yeah.
anywhere near where I thought I was.
It
And
is
those are
interesting.
really humbling moments, I think, in our
They
lives.
are, and painful as well.
Yes.
Literally and figuratively. There's I run into this a lot where I see people who have this amateur mindset, but they expect professional results. So it's really interesting because they feel like they're banging their head against the wall, and then when you suggest that maybe you're not fully committed or maybe you're not doing the work required, oh, I'm working hard as anybody else. It's like, well, if that were the case, you probably have the results. It's just interesting that people see
Yeah.
that they don't have what they want, but they're not really putting forth the required effort.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I've certainly spent many, many years working like an amateur, and I did expect professional results. And I was always amazed that I wasn't getting them. I think in a way
Yeah.
that's kind of part of the amateur attitude, that you're dumb enough that you think, gee, I'm doing this. Why isn't it happening for me? When in fact, you're really not doing it. You only think you're doing it to a certain level, but you're really not.
Does that require outside input? Like, how do you know if you are objectively putting forth the effort? Is it just a matter of the results? If you're experiencing the results, you're putting forth the effort, or is there other factors at play here? Because I
I think
imagine with you, like, there's time, and I'm not going to lie, there's fortunate circumstances that are beyond your control, and unfortunate circumstances. Some of those play a factor as well.
I think I think we all have these moments where we think we're doing great, and then we encounter a competitor, you know, that's really doing it great. And we have that
Mm,
horrible moment when you realize, oh my God, I am nowhere near at the level of this person. It's very humbling. You sort of stagger back and you go, oh my God, I better go back to ground zero and really start rebuilding my foundation or something. So I do think that does happen. If you're fortunate enough to have a mentor in any field that you're learning under, or a boss that you're bringing stuff to, and the boss keeps telling you this isn't good enough, this isn't good enough, that's helpful because you've got that comparison always in
mm.
front of you. But a lot of times, like particularly with a writer, you kind of go off on your own, right? And you spend 2 years working on something in your mind, you think you're great, um, and then maybe you get some feedback and you realize you're not.
Yeah. Is that how long, like with your novels, for example, is that how long that they took you to write? A couple of years? Is that what you're looking at?
Yeah, usually it's 2 or 3 years. And in the beginning, when nothing got sold,
Mm-hmm.
and then when you also have to work to save the money to get those 2 years,
Right.
a lot of time goes by without anything good happening.
Well, I was going to ask is, I tend to be somebody who, and I think a lot of people are like this, is the more results you see, the quicker you see them, the more engaged you can be in that pursuit. Sitting on something for 2 years without seeing the immediate benefit of that would be a real challenge for me, and I'm sure it was for you, more so probably initially than maybe it is now because you realize how it works. But how do you get through those times when you're not experiencing the results that you would have expected or hoped for, but you're still doing the work?
Well, that's another great question. I mean, I haven't even calculated the years, but I think from the time I started, left a job and started to try to write till the time I actually sold a novel was like almost 30 years.
Mm.
And now it was maybe 16 or 17 years before I started working, say, in the movies, where I actually was getting a paycheck. But it wasn't just 2 years; it was forever. And I there would be many moments. One of the jobs I used to work in was advertising. I would be a copywriter in an ad agency. I would I'd work for like 2 years, save up the money, quit, go away for 2 years, work, fail, come back again, do the whole thing over again. And at each point when I was ready to quit, to try to write the next novel, my boss or whoever it was, who would be like a friend of mine, would call me into the office and close the door, and in a very serious and friendly manner would say to me, "Look, Steve, don't throw your life away. You know, let's be realistic. You know, you've been trying this for however many years. You got a place here at this office. I'll give you a promotion. I'll give you a raise. I'll give you another title, whatever it is. But don't throw your life away like this." And I would go home after all that and I would go, "Oh my God, you know, they're right. You know, how many times am I going to do this? I'm insane, you know." And my family was the same way. They thought, you know, what is wrong with this guy? Why does he keep trying for this? But each time I would quit and try to write a book again, you know, for me, I think it was just that I would be too depressed if I would go back to working in an office or doing something shitty like that, you know? And I just couldn't do it. It was like whatever the soul drive that you have in you just wouldn't let me do it.
Mm.
But through all that time, I really felt most of the time, one voice in my head was saying, "You're out of your mind doing this. You know, why are you doing this? It's pointless, you know." And we're talking about before, like we were talking, Ryan, about getting better and were you bad? I mean, I was bad. I was really bad. And, you know, I would show a book to my friends who were like talented people, knew what they were talking about. And you could just see the plastic smile on their faces. They would, you know, try to not make you feel so bad about it, you know, but, you know, your heart was just sinking. And so I don't even know why I kept going through that. I guess I don't know. I got a letter the other day or an email the other day. I don't know. Maybe I'm babbling along here into areas we don't. But
It's actually nice to hear you not have like a well thought out, oiled answer because it's very much how I feel too when people ask that. Well, how do you know when to quit? I'm like, I don't know. Like that's never been in my thought process. That's never. And when things get hard or don't work out or somebody doesn't show up for an interview or whatever, it's like never once has it crossed my mind to like, oh, I guess it wasn't meant to be. Like it's something I can't articulate either. So it's actually refreshing to hear you not quite be able to articulate it.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I got an email the other day from a young writer, and his question was, would you go about things differently if you were starting out today?
Mm-hmm.
And he was obviously a very social media savvy guy. And
Mm-hmm.
he was talking about, you know, getting an author's platform and doing podcasts or whatever, getting a following, all of that sort of stuff. And I thought to myself, and I wrote him back and I told him, for me, there's really only one reason to be a writer. And that's because you have no choice. You know, you're just driven to do it and nothing else is going to work. You know,
Mm.
so I didn't feel very positive toward this young man that wrote me. You know, I thought, you know, he's into the current mindset of how can I do it the easy way? Is there some
Mm-hmm.
kind of a hack? Is there how can I game the system to immediately become Kim Kardashian or something like that? And to me, the whole point of being an entrepreneur or an artist or whatever it is to bring out what's inside of you that's there, that's just burning to get out, and figure out what that is in the first place, and then how to bring it out, rather than focusing on quote unquote success or clicks or followers or whatever the hell it is. It's like, why are you in this business? Are you
Mm.
in it from the inside out or from the outside in? And for me, the only way to be in anything is from the inside out.
Yeah, and ironically enough, I think when you come from that perspective, that's when the results show up. I think about previous jobs I had. Before this, I was in financial planning, and I was relatively successful at it, but it never felt like you were saying. I like how you articulated, never from the inside out. It was always from the outside in. Like, this is the path I thought you went to be successful, to earn money, to provide the lifestyle that you want for
Yeah,
yourself and
yeah.
your family. And so that's the path I chose. And again, ironically enough, I've been significantly more successful on all sorts of different metrics with this because it came from here first, and all of the other little things started to take care of themselves and to fall into place.
Let me ask you this, Ryan. Was there a moment for you where you sort of realized that? Was there an actual incident?
Yeah, there
Can you
was.
tell me
I
what it was?
remember. I can. I remember. So I was doing both at the time. I was doing my financial planning practice, which I owned at that time, and I was doing this as well. And I remember I got a phone call from one of my financial planning clients, and it was as simple as this. I pulled up my phone to look who it was, and I saw who it was, and I knew it was a client. And I remember just going, I was like, I do not want to talk to this person. And
That's
it wasn't
great.
that
I
I
love
didn't
that.
like that person. It wasn't that I didn't have a
Ah,
good relationship with them. It was that I just did not want to do that at all. And that for me was the moment I realized, all right, you got to get out of this business.
uh-huh,
And I, like you said, worked the problem, right? Worked the scenario. It
uh-huh,
took me about 6 to 8 months,
uh-huh.
and eventually went on to sell the practice and be
Ah,
fully immersed in this. But
ah.
yes, that was the moment for me.
Now, did you feel like you changed? Like, did your DNA change in that moment in some way?
I haven't thought about that, but I think looking back on it, the way I would describe it is just the level of clarity and energy and focus was immediately. It was like I lifted this weight off my
Uh-huh,
shoulders where I'm like,
uh-huh,
oh, free
uh-huh,
of, even though I wasn't completely free because I was still in the business, I felt free because I was working in it, but I was working towards what I really wanted to
uh-huh.
do.
Right. Yes, I know just what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of times, and I know I felt this way in my younger years. You're young and you're sort of lost, and you're sort of asking yourself, well, what is my calling? What
Mm-hmm.
is the thing that I was meant? And you sort of believe I should be able to solve it tomorrow. Today's Tuesday. I should be able to figure this out by Wednesday. But
Right.
in fact, I think the reality of it, like in your story, Ryan, you have to kind of go through a process. It's something inside in the soul, and it takes time before that moment when you look at the phone and you go, oh no, I don't want to talk to this guy, right?
Mm-hmm.
That couldn't have happened a day earlier, I would bet, or a year earlier. It was like the stars had to align inside you, I think, for that moment. The tumblers of a lock had to
That's a good way to
line
look at
up,
it.
and then all of a sudden it was ready to happen.
The way that I've looked at it in the past is, you're walking through this forest, or let's say you come to the edge of a forest and you're thinking about going in because you have a feeling there's something really rewarding on the other side of that forest. And what you'd like to do is get the 30,000 foot view to see what's over there before you
Uh-huh.
walk through the mess and the chaos and the
Ah,
dark and everything else you're going to deal with. But you don't have that option. You actually have to take a couple of steps before you begin to see this path that you would have never known before. And then you got to take a couple of steps down that path, and then it opens something else up. And I'm beginning to think like there isn't some reward on the other side of the forest. Like I thought there was. I think the reward is just I get more capable of walking through the forest and dealing with a meaningful pursuit, really is what it
yeah,
is for
that's
me.
a great analogy or a great metaphor. Yeah, I love that. That's great.
When you were talking with your previous boss and he was saying don't throw your life away, that was another form of the resistance. Is that how you choose to look at that?
I would say that my buying into that was a form of resistance.
Mm,
My hearing that and saying he's right, I am throwing my life away. That was, and the weird part is there is an objective reality to that. The
sure.
boss who's saying that, he's not saying it because he's a bad person or anything. He's really
Right.
looking out for your interests. So there is a reality to that. But the belief in it in your mind, that's resistance, you know?
Mm.
Um,
How you
because
choose to
if I
interpret
had
these
really
experiences then.
if I had really known, excuse me, if I
No,
had
it's good.
really been confident in myself in that moment in an office, I would be able to say, no, that's wrong. I've got to pursue this. I've got to go into that dark forest. I've got to go forward. But I wasn't confident. So what the boss would say to me would rattle me and make me think, wow, maybe he's right. Maybe he's right. And I had no clue at that time that there was such a thing as resistance. That concept was not in my mind at all. So resistance was able to really do a number on me.
So when you talk about confidence, my thought has always been you have to earn confidence. It isn't just something that, you get to have just because you want it. Like you have to do the work, and then the work is what develops and builds some level of confidence, and it's a cycle. So how do you begin to develop at least some fortitude? Maybe it's not confidence, but some fortitude when you're not confident in the path that you're taking.
Yeah, that's a great one. I think in a way, are you familiar with the concept of the daimon? Daimon.
Uh, no, I've seen
Oh,
that, but I don't think I'm familiar with it.
oh, this is a great one. It
Okay.
it comes from a book that where I first read it called The Soul's Code.
Okay.
Um, blank Hillman, James Hillman, and what he says, the daemon, from which our word, it's a Greek word, and our word demon comes from that.
Mm-hmm.
And it was thought of in the ancient days as an inhering spirit that you were born with, that you had a daemon, and that would drive you forward. And the word in Latin for the same phenomenon is genius.
Hmm.
And so I think, I'll tell you a story I've told before, but whatever. It's a good
Sure.
example of what the daemon is.
Yeah.
I have a friend named Hermes Melisanides. He won the gold medal in the a gymnastics floor exercise at the Atlanta Games in '96. And when he was a little boy, when he was like 8 years old, he saw gymnastics for the first time on TV. And he immediately went to his parents, this is in Athens, and said, Mom, Dad, I want you to sign me up and he comes from a family of doctors. His
Okay.
mother's a
Yeah.
doctor. So for him, for his parents' point of view, he was going to be a doctor. So they said, no way you're going to study gymnastics, forget it. So he went on a hunger strike and he
Hmm.
just refused to eat. And finally, after 4 days, his parents caved in and they said, okay, we'll let you train to be a gymnast, but you've also got to promise you're going to become a doctor. And he said, okay, I'll
Of
do that.
course, he'll make that deal.
So he did become a doctor and he did win the gold medal. But his daemon, was whatever that force was when he saw gymnastics, it just said to him, this is it for you. This is your thing, you know, and it wouldn't let him go. And I think that, like, for me, when a boss would say to me, don't throw your life away, and something would make me throw it away anyway, I think that was my daemon. And it is, I mean, I would bet that as you're hearing this, you could relate to it completely, because I think you've obviously got a daemon that is driving you into what you're doing with Order of Man and all of the stuff you're doing. And
Well, the
so,
only thing yes, in a way, but I've always been under the impression, or at least thought, that I could do 1,000 things and be satisfied.
really?
Right? Like
That surprises me.
I think I could. I really do. I think that I don't know if there's one thing where it's like, this is what you were born for and this is what you're meant to do. Now, the skill
Ah,
sets that I might develop and articulate and grow might be that daemon, like you're
uh-huh.
saying, but I think I could apply them in 1,000 different pursuits and be satisfied. I don't know. I'm just thinking about it from the perspective of somebody. Like, do they have to discover that one thing, or do they have the opportunity to develop it? I guess I've always looked at somebody who, like this gentleman, found that early in his life, is just fortunate to be able to have that. But I don't think most people experience that.
I mean, I love to hear stories like that, and I certainly feel like, people will say, an actor will say, my parents took me to a show when I was 9 years old and I saw Mel Brooks, do something on, and I said, that I've got to do that,
Right.
And I, I think it can branch and it can evolve, this thing, but at least in my experience, it is kind of a calling. It's a one thing, at least for me, and nothing else really will do.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense, because I've even said, I feel called to do the work that I'm doing right now. And I do believe that everything that has been in my life, from, childhood to issues in my relationship, everything, that the whole sum of everything I've gone through has actually led me to right now. I do believe that. And that is something I've shared and been vocal about. So I guess I can see that.
It's weird. It's like when you look backwards, things seem very clear. It's like, oh, the path was, carved out for me. But of course, when you're going forward, it doesn't look that way at all, right? You're wandering in the forest and you don't know where you're going.
That's so true. I remember when my mom divorced my stepfather, and I remember thinking, I was so upset. It must have been when they told me about it. I was so upset about it. And I remember vividly, and this was 25 years ago, vividly saying, why did this happen to me? Why me? Why does this happen to me? And as I've thought about that story now, I've thought, well, I know why me, because I'm deeply connected with my kids. I'm deeply connected with my wife. And had I not experienced that hardship, I'm not sure that I would be as committed of a father and a husband that I am today. And I know that happened to me so that I could be the type of man that I am right now. So it was a blessing, actually, in disguise. Didn't feel like that at the moment, but it certainly was.
Yeah. It's funny how many quote unquote blessings in disguise there are in our lives, or how many times you think this is the worst thing that ever happened to me. And then 10 years later you go, oh man, if that hadn't happened, I'd have been ruined.
Right.
Because it set me on a certain path.
Yeah, I think that requires a long-term thinking. I had a friend, she used to say, if it's not going to matter tomorrow, I don't really put too much thought into it. And then she would follow up with saying, and if it doesn't matter in a week, then I don't put much thought. And if it doesn't matter in a year, I don't put much thought into it. And that's pretty typical, is like, there's things that I remember were so painful and I thought were going to alter the course of my life. And now I can't even remember what those things are. It had no relevancy in the grand scheme of things.
And the other thing to me is, I find for myself that I really can't plan very far in advance. I mean, I'm a believer definitely in the long view of things. I really feel like my life is the long game, and that's what I've been playing for a long time. I just didn't know it. But yet I find that, like, just in terms of the books that I write, if I'm writing, book number 9 and book number 10 is coming up, I never know what number 10 is going to be until I'm looking at it right in the face. And I certainly don't know what number 11 or 12 is. And when I look back on some of the books that I've written, I don't know why, why did I go in that direction, and it was the right direction, but I had no clue. Only when I look back on it, I say, oh, I see how that, that I was dealing with certain issues on the unconscious level that I wasn't aware of. And this book kind of carried me through that, one way or another. I don't know if that makes any sense, but
it does. Well, I was actually going to ask, with as many different books as you've written, from The Legend of Bagger Vance to Gates of Fire to Do the Work and The War of Art, it's like, how do you decide what you're going to write about? It seems like most successful authors, correct me if I'm wrong, you would know more than I do, have a lane, and
Yeah.
that's the lane they stay in. They get
Yeah.
really good at
Yeah.
that thing.
You're absolutely right. And somebody like me is like a nightmare for an editor for a
I
publishing
bet.
house, you know,
I imagine.
because I keep switching genres, and people who might have liked the book I wrote 2 years ago, you know, it's like a band that brings out an album and they've suddenly changed their sound, and it's
Right.
like, who's going to follow them? But again, like what we were just saying, Ryan, if I look back and I look through the titles, I can see there's a straight line running through them. You
Hmm.
know, it might not seem like it, but there is. But I also, I'm a big believer in the Muse. I believe in that inspiration comes from another place, and that we're sort of being led on a journey. And so I'm just sort of trying to get the next assignment, from heaven, and
Yeah.
then enact that assignment. So that's why I say I can never predict ahead of time where I'm going to go with something like that. And in a way, I think it's great, because the artist journey is surprising. That's all there is to it.
Well, I think for a lot of people, it poses a lot of doubt and question and uncertainty. But those like yourself who have embraced the uncertainty find it actually pretty liberating. People always ask me things like, "Oh, where do you see this being in 3 years?" I'm like, I don't even know what I'm having for dinner tonight, let alone
Yeah,
what this is going to look like in
yeah,
3 years.
exactly. Yeah.
And I'm okay with that. There was a time where I wasn't okay with that, but now I'm enjoying it to the point where I'm like, I don't know, but wherever it is going to be awesome.
I mean, if you just think about this virus thing that we're all dealing with now, I mean, who knew this was going to happen 10
Right, of
weeks ago,
course.
right? I mean,
Right.
there were indications, in China and stuff, but nobody knew that the entire country was going to go, bug nuts over this,
Mm-hmm.
and so in a way, it is sort of arrogant to think, oh yeah, I can plot out the 5-year plan. I'm going to be, really,
Yeah, yeah, great point.
even just the external stuff, not to mention our internal stuff that we don't know about.
Right, right. What do you see the distinction? You talk about the muse and now you're talking about heaven. Like, what is the distinction between the muse and what I would say is God?
That's a great question. They could be the same thing in a way.
Okay,
I
right.
mean, I'm definitely a believer that we live life on two levels. That we're down here on the material level, and there's a level above us, and the daemon has something to do with that. And the
Mm,
level above us is much wiser than we are, and is plugged into, I mean, the phrase that I've heard that I like is the divine ground, is plugged into or is adjacent to some wisdom that's infallible that we can't describe. And I
right.
think that what borders on that are like dreams, the deep unconscious, whatever it is, or intuition that we have, or inspiration that we have. Like the moment when you looked at the phone and it was from the financial planning guy, something was happening in that moment.
Mm,
Some intelligence knew with crystal clarity and was delivering something to you in that moment. So you could call it the muse, you could call it God, you could call it the quantum soup, whatever.
right,
It's whatever that
right.
mysterious force is that that athletes, when they get into the zone, they get into that, or artists when they really hit their stride are into that. And in many ways, I feel like my life is kind of the pursuit of that,
Mm.
or that I'm trying to serve that. I'm trying to tune into that cosmic radio station, tune in and get that signal, and then try to follow that signal.
How do you personally do that?
For
Tune
me,
in, that is.
it's in real nuts and bolts sense. For me, it's like I live my life kind of project to project, book to book, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Whatever it is, I'm in this one, completely, and then when the next one comes up, like when I worked on the book about Israel, the '67 war. I mean, I just gave myself over to that completely. Was over there and was in it 100%. So while I'm working on one project, I'm constantly asking myself, what's the next one?
Hmm.
What's, and I'm trying out ideas, I sort of, something will come in and I'll say, oh, that's an interesting thing. And I'll kind of say, is that it? Is that the one? And then there'll be something else. And I'm just waiting for that kind of moment when I go, kind of like with you with the phone, where I go, that's the one,
Really?
And at
Yeah.
that point, then I kind of commit to that.
And
And
it is like an aha moment for you that you feel like that. Is that the
yeah,
way you would describe it?
yes. Although sometimes the aha moment takes a few months.
Sure, of
Sometimes it's
course, yeah.
several aha. It's an aha, then it's a bigger aha, then it's another aha. But yeah,
It's like, wait, I thought you wanted me to do this, and now you're telling me to do this?
yeah. But it usually isn't like that. It's usually fairly clear.
Yeah. I'm amazed with your level of immersion. The other person that I think of is Jack Carr. I think you just recently
Oh yeah,
did
yeah,
an
yeah.
event or something
Just
with
met him.
Jack.
I've never met him in person. He's a wonderful guy. I'm going
He's
to
such a
meet him
great
in like a
guy.
few weeks. Yeah.
I've been friends with Jack for about 2.5 years now.
Ah,
And I've been amazed with his level of immersion. I mean, he goes to Africa and he works with
yeah,
poachers and he's
yeah,
getting all of this intel and insight. And then, of course, he's got his SEAL background. And then he takes that, like, he is fully immersed. I see the same thing in actors. We think it's
yes,
weird, right? But
yes,
you see actors who don't break character, for
yeah,
example.
yeah.
It's like they got to immerse themselves. I can actually, as strange as maybe it is, I can appreciate the level of immersion and attention and professionalism, like we were talking about earlier, towards their craft. I can certainly appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, it's always amazing to me, like when they have to change their bodies, actors,
Yes.
like you're going to be playing Leonidas and you've got to
Right.
have six pack abs and you've got like, 4 months to get them, uh, or you
Did
got
you
to
do any
gain like
consulting
Robert
on
De
that?
Niro. I'm sorry.
Right. Oh, I was gonna
Yeah.
say I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I was asking if you did any sort of consulting or anything like that with for the movie 300. I really don't know.
No, it's an interesting question. It's actually when at that time, movies get what they call in development,
Mm-hmm.
and production entities will option a book or something like that, and then
Right.
they'll have a script written, blah blah blah, and it's moving forward. And they're trying to get actors attached, and they're trying to get a director, and trying to get financing. And so, Gates of Fire and the book 300, the graphic novel by Frank Miller, they
Mm-hmm.
were on kind of tracks together, and it was a
Sure.
question of which one is going to win, which one is going to
Ah.
get financing first. And 300 won, and so it became a movie. But Gates of Fire never had anything to do with that at all. Nobody talked to me, and they shouldn't have. It was really a whole other project.
Why do you what made the difference? Do you think if they were running on the same track, like what would make the difference for the studio to choose one over the other?
I mean, it were different studios, like
Ah,
for
okay.
instance, with Gates of Fire, they had for a while, they had George Clooney was attached. And then they had the director, Michael Mann was attached. And then what would happen would they'd choose another project. Oh, I'm going to make this movie. So now they're out of
Mm,
action for 18 months. And so I think the 300 just got it together. They found the director, Zack Snyder, and they found the cast, and they got the money,
it
and,
worked
and, it,
out.
and it worked. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting because I knew that they weren't attached. As I was reading the book, obviously there's some differences. It runs. It's the same story generally, but there was some differences. Like how much research went into the book? I mean, obviously it's well researched. Is it a book that's as factual as possible, or is there like how much liberty is taken in the book? I'm really curious about that.
It's as factual as possible.
Okay,
But
right.
that being said, we scholars, historians, know very little about ancient Sparta.
Mm,
The culture was very secretive. I mean, it's a kind of a crazy thing that words actually written by an actual Spartan, I think we have like 47 words total.
really?
So everything else comes from other writers in the ancient world that knew of the Spartans, or had contact with them, but the Spartans were very secretive. Um, so a lot of what's in Gates of Fire is me, imagining it, but it's imagining it according to the truth that we do know.
Right.
So I'm not like going off on tangents that are a bunch of bullshit. I'm just
Right.
really trying to sort of, for instance, there's a part in there, I don't know if you've gotten to it yet, called The Science of Fear,
Okay.
which the Greek word was phobologia.
I haven't
And
got to that point. So,
uh, so I remember I just thinking to myself, every great culture like the samurai, the warrior culture, had the
hmm
code of Bushido, right?
hmm
And it had definitely had tenets and exercises, and it was a really well thought out, deep philosophy, right? And I thought, well, the Spartans had to have something like that too, but we don't know what it is because it was never written down in that day, and nobody has really translated. They kept it secret. So I sort of kind of asked myself, as a writer of fiction now, because it's historical fiction, I thought, well, what was that thing? And I just made it up. I said, it was a science of fear, and it was
Mm.
da 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 da. And so I often wondered if we actually could beam a real Spartan from that era
Right.
back and show him what he would say. Oh, that's bullshit. We didn't have anything like, or would he say, wow, you were right on target. Well, you really had something like that.
Yeah. Well,
So
maybe
you,
in the
you never
afterlife,
know.
you'll be able to answer that. Somebody will answer that question for you.
Yeah, maybe so.
No, I really enjoy it because obviously there's some elements of, okay, well, this is what I imagined it would have been like, but it just seems so, everything about it seems so thorough and realistic. I'm like, oh, okay, well, it's interesting. I wonder why they kept everything so secretive. Do you know anything about that? Why it was so secretive, or why it wasn't well documented? Because they seem to be such a cohesive culture. I'm just really
Yes.
curious why it wasn't documented as well as maybe it could have
Here's
been.
what I think it was. And I think this is a pretty good guess from the academic stuff that you can read. Sparta was really, in its own mind, a culture of virtue.
Mm-hmm.
And it was warrior virtue, but they definitely had, they were sort of, this is a kind of an odd analogy, but like, say, the Amish or the Quakers or something like that, where they really felt like they were a world apart and that the rest of the world was corrupt. There
Mm.
was no money allowed in Sparta, right? Because they felt that money corrupted people and would corrupt people from the virtue, the pursuit of money. So the reason they kept foreign influences out was they felt that they would bring them down from their virtue, and so that was why they were so secretive. They just felt like we don't want to let anybody in and screw things up. It's like kind of like the virus. They kept the viruses of bad habits out.
Right.
Well, that was their point of view, and they believed in not writing anything down. They didn't have a constitution that was written down. They didn't have anything like that, because they felt that if something precepts lived in a person's heart, that was where it really counted. And so I think it was the idea that they were a culture of virtue, and they didn't want to be contaminated by any external influences. And of course, what happened after the Peloponnesian War, the big 27-year war with Athens, was
Mm-hmm.
Sparta was kind of compelled out into the wide world, and they did get corrupted. And in fact, they were easily corrupted because they were so sheltered in a way in their own hermetically sealed place, So it did, the mythos kind of crashed at some point.
Right. It's interesting. I just contrast that with our culture, America, and I think, man, we're so divided. Like what you believe to be so right and so true and virtuous and moral, and with every fiber in your being, there's another person out there who equally
Right.
believes as
Right.
fervently about their
Right.
position, which is at direct odds with yours.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think there's merit in some of that. And I think that there's some potential destruction and calamity in that as well. It's just a very weird,
Yeah.
so it's just a weird place to be.
Yeah.
And I don't know what a better solution is. Is it to completely isolate like the Spartans did, or is it to open it up to anyone and everyone like we tend to do? It's
Yeah.
very interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I was just, thinking the other day that if we could beam an Athenian from the past into the present America today, the Athenian would be right at home, would be
Mm,
aware of influences from all over the world, a culture, there'd be the courts of law, the democracy, arts, and and corruption. Many ideas are floating around. But if we brought a Spartan back, they would be like from another planet, and they would look at us and despise us, or they would shake their heads and say, this is what we were afraid was going to happen. This is why we were so secretive. We were afraid it was going to deteriorate to this, and oh my God, it has deteriorated.
Yeah. Were the Spartans family oriented, or were they more community and looked at the politicians and leaders more of that authority figure? How did that dynamic work in their culture?
It was a bit of both. Like, for instance, from the time. Well, for instance, when a boy was 7 years old, he was taken away from his family and enrolled in what they call the agoge, the upbringing, and he stayed with the other boys for the whole until they were 18, and they became, officially a warrior, officially an adult. And then at that point, they were, until I think 30 or even older than that, they were not allowed to take their meals at home with their family, ever. They only ate in what they called a common mess, which was with maybe 18 other men who were like basically their platoon, the guys that they would go to war with. And it was very important that that group contained all ages. There would be a guy that was 60 years old and a guy that was, 50 and 40, all the way, because they knew that, like, if they had just young guys, they'd go crazy like a college fraternity, right?
Yeah, Lord of the Flies type stuff.
Yeah. So it was, and very much the elders felt like they were being mentors and indoctrinating the youngers, little by little. So in a way, it was not so family oriented. It really was kind of the community at large type of situation.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm just so fascinated. I can't wait to continue to go through it because, I think it's important to look at this history and extract what seems to work well and maybe not take into consideration or into our culture what didn't work so well. So it's always good to go through this history and gain these lessons and these perspectives that I think a lot of people have overlooked when they consider how we are moving forward and how we are progressing in our own culture.
Yeah. I mean, I wish that more people would read history, in whatever form. And I wish I would read more history because, there's been so many different ways that human beings have organized themselves, and what they believed in, what they thought was a virtue and what was a vice, and et cetera, that the more you learn about that, the more it helps to understand what's going on now, even though it's still completely nuts.
Right. Are there other cultures that you've come across that would be good for men to study, to look at, to emulate, to learn from?
Well, for me, like, the ancient world is really what I've study. That's the only thing that I really know. I don't really know about Japanese culture or anything like that. But Spartan culture, Athenian culture, the Macedonians under Alexander the Great, the Romans, who had great writers and great thinkers. That whole era is, to me, a really, really fascinating era.
Yeah, I've been fascinated with the Stoics. I actually listened to a podcast. I think you did. I think it may have been earlier this year with Ryan Holiday, he's been on the podcast a couple of times, and it was interesting to hear your guys' perspective and the take on the concepts of Stoicism and Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus. That was really interesting.
I really agree with Ryan Holiday that's very applicable today.
Oh, no doubt.
To us as individuals trying to find our way.
Yeah. Yeah, I know that you've been very influential in his life and his writing and the things that he's done. So it's cool to be able to talk with both of you.
Yeah, he's been very influential in mine too.
He's pretty incredible. Well, Stephen, I want to let you go. I just want to let you know I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about these different works and have this conversation, because this has been a real honor for me, and I know as the guys tune in, they're going to really gain a lot from what we went through as well. I do want to ask you a couple of questions. The first one is, and I prepared you, I told you about this one, is what does it mean to be a man?
Okay, I'm going to answer that as a writer or as an artist. And I do think that there is such a thing as being a man as opposed to being a woman. Mm-hmm. That a man is different from a woman, and that it's incumbent upon us as men to sort of go into that dark forest that you were talking about before, and not to stay on the outside. So I would say, and I'll go back to my concept of the daemon that I was talking about. And I really feel as an artist, as a writer, that I'm a servant of the muse, that I'm a servant of that higher dimension I was talking about before. And so to me, being a man is that when that level, and this is aside from family or anything like that, this is kind of really more on calling, on the subject of calling or vocation, to when that call comes, that number one, that you will answer it, that you will not answer it. And on the other hand, that you'll be ready, that you'll have the tools, that you'll have the mental tools and the emotional tools to be able to respond to that call, whatever it is. And then, so it is really, using your forest analogy, it's like the world sort of presents you with that forest. Those trees come up in front of you, and my definition of a man is that he will go into those trees and will find the way, or at least give it everything he's got
right
to find that way.
Yeah, I like that. One of the things that we've talked quite a bit about, and David Gilmour, are you familiar with David Gilmour? He's got a book, Manhood in the Making, that I really like.
No, I'm
He's got
not.
some other works. Anyways, he talks about and makes the distinction, and Jack Donovan talks about this as well, the distinction between being a good man and being good at being a man, which I think is what you're highlighting here. You're talking about morality, right? Coming from this higher plane. But that's not enough. It's not enough to be tapped into there. You have to have that capability as well. You have to have the ability to act on your moral thoughts and ideas and the direction that you get from that higher plane.
Yes, I would say that. Yeah. I would agree with that. David Gilmour,
Manhood in the Making is the book that it comes from.
I'm writing this down.
Yeah, he's got some interesting works. Well, Stephen, I want to let you know again, I appreciate you. What an honor to talk with you. The men who listen in are going to get a lot of value from what we're doing here, and I'm excited to see what else you have in the works, because I will be a reader of whatever it is.
Well, Ryan, it's been a real pleasure talking with you. It's been a great conversation here. Thank you for having me. If you ever want to do this again, let me know. We'll do it again.
Yeah, I'm going to take you up on that. Much appreciated.
All right. Thank you very much, and thanks to all your listeners too.